Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast, your weekly podcast for everything PowerShell, interviews, conversations with those that make the PowerShell world go round. If you haven't yet, check out the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. Check out the PowerShell scripting channel. It's been really cool to see that kind of sub-community grow a little bit. A lot of cool interactions. And to get things started off on the pre-show this week, I want to highlight a project, PS Pushover, by Josh OOAJ, former podcast guest. Check it out. It is a way to interact with the Pushover service to send SMS. I was talking to Mike Nelson, and I guess maybe we'll come full circle on this once the podcast starts with our lovely guest. But it's a cool way to send text messages. And if you star that repo in the show notes, it will ping Josh's phone. So bother him. Let's try and DDoS him by starring it a bunch of times. Cool blog for the week. Creating a development Windows sandbox using PowerShell and Winget on PowerShellIsFun.com. Shout out Harm Veenstra. Always active with the blog. Always dropping cool new ideas. There is another blog, PowerShell, a Microsoft 365 admin roles membership report, which is a way to get a report on the admin roles. Shout out to Kevin Trent for that one. I have to give a plug to psweekly.doused.dev by Matthew Doused. Every single week, he curates all the links. I go through a few of them. Sometimes I breach outside of that PS Weekly, but it's definitely a great resource if you want to keep up what's happening all across the community. And let's get into it. I want to introduce our guest for this podcast, Anthony Nocentino. He is a senior principal field solution architect at Pure Storage, a Microsoft data platform MVP, community person, Pluralsight author, educator extraordinaire. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me, sir. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, it's cool. I've been seeing you for a long time. I believe we met in 2018.
Right.
And then I saw you at PowerShell Saturday. Or PowerShell on the River, I think is what it was called. I remember it, man. I think, were you doing SQL stuff or were you getting into Kubernetes back then?
That was like a good confluence of tech at that time. Because my PowerShell journey started in 16, which we can talk about in a little bit if you want to.
Yeah.
But at that time in 18, I was elbow deep in the Kubernetes space, trying to figure out and learn as much as I can. You know, it's kind of not quite the advent of that, but when it kind of bled over into our world as Microsoft professionals, things like SQL Server on Linux, SQL Server on Kubernetes became a thing. So I spent tons of time working on that tech around that time.
Fun time. I remember my impression of Kubernetes was like, holy crap, this is so cool.
It is.
But it's also really confusing. So it kind of, I held back. I think I did myself a disservice by not jumping in.
Right.
What's
I was
your
like
take?
that with Azure, actually. Initially, I was like, this isn't going to be a thing. And then here we are, 15 years later. And I regretted that. Like, I felt like it was like lost time. So then I spent a whole bunch of time catching up around that same time, 17, 18, learning the Azure space too. But the complexity thing. All right, so let's get into that. I genuinely think that Kubernetes is simple, right? And people get scared or not scared, but intimidated by, there's lots of moving parts. But if you really look at the system as a whole, there's some elegance in its simplicity. Things like control loops for maintaining the state of a system, like the desired state, are fundamentally simple concepts, especially in the PowerShell universe that we're interested in. If you go back to things like DSC, right, desired state configuration, like defining like what you want to have happen in a system declaratively. And so when you start thinking about kind of that controller state declarative model, you start to piece those things together. I think the hardest thing for folks to get around, especially folks that come from like the data world like me, is how do you deal with persistent state applications? But that becomes a really interesting way to manage systems when you decouple the configuration of the system and the state of the system. That really kind of, I think, frees things up from how you manage your environment in code specifically.
So what is Kubernetes? For those who have heard of it, they maybe think of containers, or what is Kubernetes though?
Ooh, all right, man. I've written books on this. You're gonna do this in like 3 minutes. All right. So what is Kubernetes? So Kubernetes is a way to declaratively deploy container-based applications. That was like a really complex way to describe something, I think. And what you're really doing in the Kubernetes space is defining what you want to have happen in the system. So if I have a collection of applications, I write a bunch of code, I deploy that in the system, and that change happens. Those applications become deployed. But more simply, I like to say that Kubernetes has one job, dramatic pause, right? It's to start containers on servers, full stop, right? But the challenging part then is doing that in an enterprise grade way, like dealing with fault domains, dealing with load balancers and networking, dealing with security. But in the end, Kubernetes has one job. I want to start a container-based application on some piece of compute in a data center or cloud.
Fair enough. And compare now to then. I feel like a lot of modern applications and companies are building around Kubernetes or building on Kubernetes, I guess you might say. Do you see that as well? Is that kind of like the de facto way to go about creating scalable applications in the modern era?
Absolutely. Scalable, maintainable is the bigger part, right? Like being able to build systems that are maintainable. The superpower of Kubernetes from a business standpoint, and this is what I want people to understand the most, the superpower of Kubernetes is getting code out of developers' brains into production as fast as possible. That's the superpower of Kubernetes, because think about how we had to do that in the before times. Well, I wrote some code, I compiled it, I committed it, packaged the application, I handed it off to the ops team. They go, and especially in the Windows space, they next finish. I open a ticket to get that server added to the load balancer that now can send traffic to it. And that took what? Days? Right. But the superpower of Kubernetes is to be able to take code, commit it to a repo, have a build process kicks off that creates a container that potentially can deploy that automatically into a cluster to get that application into production as fast as possible. What that means is your business is moving faster, right? The code that you need to write isn't because you like to write code. It's because you're making a new feature or you're fixing a bug, right? Or making your application more scalable, and you can affect those changes more rapidly in Kubernetes than you can in a traditional ITM.
I was going to ask this, but it sounds like CI/CD and Kubernetes are kind of required. You can't do Kubernetes without the CI/CD. Is that fair to say?
Ish. Yeah. It just depends on how far you want to extend it. And that becomes a philosophical slash, what's what I'm looking for? A philosophical slash risk tolerance model, right? In that, do you trust your automated tests to automatically deploy this new application into production, right? Those kind of things you have to take into account.
So maybe some industries that wouldn't be a good fit, but for by and large, it sounds like that's going to be where people find themselves.
Yeah. And even in the biggest of big enterprises that I see now where I work is you still have the big applications that are traditionally deployed that run the business. But when people are looking at what the next 3 to 5 to 10 years of an application is going to look like in a business, it's Kubernetes first now.
And you've written a lot of Pluralsight courses or published a lot of Pluralsight courses on Kubernetes over the years. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I had the benefit and absolute privilege to write the Certified Kubernetes Administrator courses for Pluralsight. The funny story is about that, I had just finished the Linux Foundation certification stuff for Pluralsight, and they were like, hey, listen, some cert objectives change. We want you to kind of go repaint this course a little bit to get it up to date. And I'm like, no, listen, this is like 2018. I'm like, we need to do this. And I'm like, because the CKA had just came out maybe about a year before. And I'm like, we need to write the cert content for this. And they were like, nah, we're good. Go do the Linux stuff. And so I get off the Zoom with my person that I worked with at Pluralsight. And an hour later, he's like, hey, listen, we're going to do this. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah. He's like, right now. And so, because apparently there was another push inside the business that they needed somebody to do this that he wasn't aware of. And then the horse was out of the barn, and we did some pretty cool stuff. I'm really proud of that work, honestly.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember watching those back in the day. You have a bunch of stuff. So Linux plays a role in your background. Can you kind of give me a bit of insight as to how you got into data, SQL, and then the transition to Kubernetes?
So the big picture is I like to jokingly say, at least my first job was making green lights blink in data centers, right? I did routing and switching for a long time. I thought that was the cat's meow, early 2000s. Then I slowly worked up the stack. I did a bunch of Windows and server administration. I did a bunch of Linux administration. I did a bunch of Citrix work for a while. Then I kind of landed in the DBA space, and I was like, oh, this is really enjoyable. I like this. Because at the time I was studying computer science academically, working on a PhD. And what I found in database systems is that I got a little bit of everything. I got a little bit of systems, right? The hardcore plumbing stuff that I liked. I got some application development. I got some theory and how things like query compilation works. And it was really satisfying intellectually to work on database systems. It still is. And then at that time, I started consulting independently. And there's a long story behind that, but we can do that for another show.
Is that Nocentino Systems?
Yeah, Nocentino Systems. So that was 12 years of full-time work. Enjoyed every minute of it. But when you build a business, you can't have one revenue stream. And at the time, I was just consulting. Like I was working on SQL Server, I was working on Linux, high-performance systems, mostly e-commerce, transportation was kind of my jam. And what I realized is like I need to diversify my revenue streams. And so that's when I started doing the Pluralsight work, because now I kind of decouple, where the money's coming from a business standpoint, which is like your primary goal when you run a business, or a primary goal. And so then I met Don Jones. Y'all may have heard of this person.
Yep.
Site. And it was a whirlwind. Like this, it was amazing to work with him. He's a brilliant person. I can produce content faster than anyone I've ever seen. And that started the Linux training, and then that evolved into the Kubernetes training, and then that evolved into the Azure training with Pluralsight. And then COVID hits, right? Ooh, then the world stops, and we do all the things. So at that time, I had all the spare time in the world. So I learned how to make really good pizza at home. Follow me on Instagram. I also learned, wrote a couple books. But then at the time, I was still doing the training and stuff for Pluralsight. And a friend of mine, Marsha Pierce and Argenis Fernandez, who work at Pure, were like, hey, you should come work at Pure. We think you'd be good at it. And I was like, okay. So I stopped consulting, and now I have honestly the greatest job on the planet. I get to really do three things that challenge me intellectually at work, where I get to work directly with our customers. I get to work directly with engineering to build new things. And I get to go and experiment and build new things in labs that can potentially become solutions for our customers. Like I really wouldn't trade this job for, don't tell my boss, I need some negotiation leverage. But I really do have the greatest job on the planet. So.
I mean, you are a sought after candidate with your experience. I think you could find other things. So shout out to your bosses that might be listening. But so where did that come from? Because I feel like most people just kind of fall into a career and they just kind of keep clocking in, maybe get a raise here or there. Oh, hey, I'm kind of qualified for a new job. It's been 6 years. They go for it. But you seem a little bit more driven and really willing to put yourself out there. Was that something that was just inherent? Were you into teaching people before you got into tech? Or how does that work out? Because you seem very comfortable with it now, but I imagine that that's been a bit of a journey.
Oh, yeah. No. There's a couple angles I can approach this story from. I was the typical, like, look at your shoes nerd in the beginning of my career. Absolutely, 100%. I knew what I was good at. I knew what I liked. And as the stuff that we talked about earlier, the different stops along the career path that we talked about a few minutes ago, I had the luxury of having a mentor, Paul Randall, who's a big fish in the SQL Server community. And he mentored me for about a year. And he's like, listen, you need to figure out how you're going to scale your company. Because he was basically telling me how to run a company from a mentoring standpoint. Super fantastic. And that's where he's like, you have to do one of two things. You either scale the number of people in your company, or you scale your message, like the number of people that you reach out to. So I had a choice. And I didn't want to hire employees because I was absolutely petrified at the prospect of, or the potential of being responsible for someone else's family financially. Like that was not a fish that I wanted to fry. So I'm like, all right, so let's go figure out how to public speak. And so he challenged me. He's like, by the end of this year, I want you to speak publicly 3 times at events. I'm like, let's do it. And if you go onto my GitHub repo, you'll see all through 15 and 2016, I think I did 12 sessions that year at events. I'm like, I went into it as the deep end of the pool and just tore the Band-Aid off, whatever metaphor you want to use, and learned, hopefully, I don't know, to be good at that thing, teaching and scaling the message. And then I learned I really liked it. So then I just kept going. And 15, 16 is about when Pluralsight took off. So kind of in that same scale your message story. In addition to public speaking, it was working with Pluralsight to cast that net out wider to reach a broader community. And if I go back and look at the metrics of people that I've helped teach through books, blogs, conferences, are almost up to 1 million people. Which
That's
is
huge.
totally
Let's go.
humbling. Yeah, it's totally humbling to have that level of reach, thanks to all the avenues I've been able to take advantage of over the years.
That's huge. That's exciting. And I think there's many other people listening that have learned lessons that are valuable to others. And maybe they're not going to reach 1 million, but when you're able to take things that you've learned and pay it forward to others, it benefits you, but it also benefits others, helps you solidify the ideas. Yeah. Love hearing that trend whenever I interview people.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm totally going to add a dimension to that. I think the biggest thing is I love sharing. I still blog, right? I don't tweet as much as I used to, but I love creating a thing and saying, look, this is how this thing works, right? And that sharing of information is so gratifying to me individually. And so that, I think that's the driver in the end. Like, that's the thing in the back of the brain that keeps me doing this thing.
Yep, that's the right approach. And it sounds like I'm in a similar-ish spot to where you were, where I went to a conference last week and I heard many times from people that have given me some mentorship over the years that I need to do more talks at conferences. So, but I want to pivot into systems, because you've mentioned systems a few times, and I geek out every time I think about it. It's been one of the things that in my career so far, and kind of, I guess, developing as a human at the same time, I have found an absolute love of systems of any kind.
Yes.
And what I've realized is that a business, which is, you ran a business, you started a business, it really is just a collection of systems. Does that resonate with you? And does it appeal to you for the same way that maybe like Kubernetes, like that whole systems thing?
Within the context of running a business?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at computer systems, or even just systems in general, you have inputs and outputs and changes in state, right? Simple enough. And how do you control your inputs and outputs, and how do you affect the change in state, are how you manage those things. And so when you're running a business, obviously you have to worry about customer pipeline, you have to worry about revenue streams, which we talked about. And then also you have to be constantly reevaluating, are you making the right decisions right now? And I'm fortunate enough to have a fantastic partner in my life, my wife, who's probably the most intelligent person that I know. And she helped me run that business for an extended period of time. And I'd say, hey, this crazy thing I want to do. And she's like, that's a great idea. That's a terrible idea. And having someone to bounce those kind of things off of, not I would say every day, but certainly we could. But having someone to collaborate around those things is absolutely invaluable. And I had Paul as a mentor, and then our community is fantastic. I'd go to events and I wouldn't talk about folks, talk about tech, absolutely. But hey, what do you think about this industry trend? What do you think about this thing? And one story behind that is Joey Aiello, for the folks that remember Joey, right?
Yeah.
PowerShell Summit exclusively. Like, I can't describe another community where this will happen. I said, hey, Joey, I want to talk to you about containers. Sat me down for an hour and a half on the top floor of the main bow. We talked about container strategy for Microsoft, right? Where else would that happen? And so, that's the biggest thing about running a company is getting out of your own way and understanding that how you're going to drive things forward and looking at the technology trends. And then that drives the output, which is going to be things like content, revenue, profit, and then ultimately, where you want to be within your career. Do you want to grow a business, or do you want to continue to drive your brand forward? And that's kind of the road that I took. Did
you know that you needed to find a niche, or that it was better to specialize rather than just being a general IT person?
Oh, you got to have a niche, 100%. And there's two dimensions to this. I thought my niche was high performance SQL Server consulting. I thought that was my niche when I was doing it, and it wasn't. Because what wound up happening is my niche was the ability to drive across an organization and affect change. Sounds kind of abstract, right? But it's a big deal.
Yes.
So my entry point into my customers would be, hey, I fixed the SQL Server problem. Hey, I fixed this SQL Server problem at scale across 1,000 SQL servers in your environment. But what wound up happening is the C-level people, or the directors that hired me, realized what I was able to do was work across their organization at different levels and have meaningful conversations with the networking teams, with the storage teams, with the developers, to affect change in an org. And that that force multiplier for a CIO or director is really, that became my niche over time. But in retrospect, that took me a couple of years to figure that out. Like that was actually the superpower that I had. And so you do, like when you do consulting, if that's the route folks want to go, you have to have a niche because that's your entry point. But then you can kind of branch out and help solve bigger, broader problems. Because if you go to a customer and say, I solve business challenges, they're like, how are you different than anybody else? Right. And then, you build that relationship and that brand, and then that just grows exponentially over time.
You're speaking my language, because that's what I view my biggest asset to a team. Yeah, I could do technical stuff, but it's the ability to drive change across an org, to be able to have conversations with people, to get them bought in and all that kind of thing.
100%.
What skills enabled you to do that? Was it just your willingness to have the talks? Were you always good at communicating with people? Was it something that you got better at over time and kind of sucked at in the beginning?
Definitely got better at over time. Jokingly, my wife will say she takes full credit for all of this, but being able to get out of your shell and get out of your own way, and approach problems without ego. I think that's a huge element. I remember distinctly, and I've told this story at conferences many times. I had a customer who thought this was a database problem, but when you went to the emergency room, it took 47 seconds for your patient record. That's a long time, right? And I don't want my physician to wait 47 seconds for my patient record to load, or whenever they clicked anything in the application. So they're making, potentially life and death decisions on this information that is now slow. And so I had to go figure out why. And one of the ways I was able to figure out why is I got all the people and literally put them in a room, and you just ask questions without judgment. That's the key thing. Hey, explain to me how this works, or why did you make that configuration choice there? Help me understand that. And we were able to get the load time of the page down dramatically because there was a switch misconfiguration at the top of rack switch on a fiber channel network. Go figure, right? And so that ability to have that conversation without judgment across that entire group of people, I think is what's going to make folks super powerful in however they communicate with others. And how I got to this point was, I think it was just kind of that story, like over time, I didn't say no. I just, oh, you want to do this conference? You want to do this thing? You want to help with this problem? You do have to learn how to say no eventually. But from a growth standpoint, being able to not say no to opportunities. And obviously you're gonna fill your bandwidth up, and then you got to start saying no, because then you get stressed out and like work too much. But balancing all those things.
So with the way you ask questions, to me, it sounds like that's sort of your way to understand the systems at play and really figure out what's going on. And once you understand the problem area that you're dealing with, it's a lot easier to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think that having a consultant with an outside perspective to come in who hasn't seen the same thing forever can be really helpful with that.
Totally. I think, one of the, it's much like the Kubernetes conversation in the beginning. System is hard. You got inputs, you got outputs, and I got to move the stuff between the systems as fast as possible. Where's the bottleneck? Let's go. Right. And from a performance standpoint, that's the thing. From an application deployment standpoint, we talked about earlier, Kubernetes enables, right, the system to move faster in time. And that's that constant iteration of speed is what we need to, that's what I focused on, how to make things happen faster.
Man, I'm getting a lot of advice. I am taking notes over here. You're dropping gems out here. So,
oh boy.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Rewarding journey though, because it sounds like, I try and tell people all the time that when you do things the right way and you try and really push things forward, it benefits so many people. It benefits you and everyone around you, the communities you're a part of. It increases your job security and all that kind of happy career stuff. But like on a personal level though, you've enjoyed it?
Oh, 100%. And I don't know if I'd change anything. All of the experience that I've had, have kind of just brought me to where I am today. And I'm super fortunate. Like I check myself periodically. Like, am I just really damn lucky, or did I actually do the right things? And you kind of like it's like a knife's edge, but it's probably a little bit of both in the end. And so that's just be mindful of your development over time. Invest in yourself 100%. Right? I don't have a lot of books behind me because they look cool. I mean, they do look cool, but these are things that I read constantly. I learn constantly, and as tech changes, AI, whatever is next, is we're going to invest in that, learn that. What makes that good, makes that bad, right? Where are the sharp edges?
Speaking of AI,
Oh boy.
how has that impacted your world? Because it's shaking the whole world. So how about you, your little corner over there?
Yeah. So luckily in my day job at Pure, I'm very focused on our traditional relational database business. That's what I drive forward. But we also know, if we've seen, that the traditional database players, the Oracles, the Microsofts, the Postgres, are starting to draw that information into their world. He's got an AI play now. And one of the things that I'm trying to focus on is what's next. What's going to happen in 3 months, 6 months? Enterprise data space. Like that's where I play. And where do I see things coalescing over time? So I'm very much so in a information gathering phase about what I see happening in the AI space. And like I said, constantly learning. I'm just absorbing as much information that I can so that I can help drive the strategy forward for Pure around those topics.
So you like it or no?
I think the outcomes of AI haven't yet paid dividends on the investments in AI. Literally just from a dollars and cents standpoint. You know, we see some market fluctuations. We see some hot news articles that are like AI failed on this project, AI failed on that project. And so that's one of the things I'm monitoring is AI able to deliver the outcomes such that the investments that have been made pay the actual dividends that customers and that businesses need. And so that's one of the key elements that I'm watching in the industry now. So I mean, don't get me wrong, I enjoy using the chat GPTs and making fun of the code that it auto generates and all that fun stuff, but it's also helped me do some things from a content development standpoint that have been great. Now, I'm not throwing all my content in there and saying, make this thing, but what I am doing is helping me change my writing styles or help me reword sentences that I'm having a challenging time with. But that's very point solutions. And I think folks have had much grander scale visions on what AI should be in the world. One of the sub components or facets of AI that has interested me significantly, especially in the systems and performance space, is ML or machine learning on dealing with streams of data in real time and making decisions on system state in real time. So that's a place that I've spent a lot of time studying personally. And I did my PowerShell Summit talk this year was on that exact topic, where I took a bunch of performance data, ran it through a machine learning pipeline, and spit out predictions. And so those are places that I found to be very interesting.
Okay, so I thought you were going to just dump on it hardcore.
Poo-poo on it. No,
it sounds like it has its uses, but again, like you said, the investment thing, the power investment, the engineering investment, they're clearly investing, but
yeah. Like, so a friend of mine at work sent me this article. It's like, hey, the Paris Olympics, which just wrapped up, are using the heat generated from AI compute farms to heat the pool at the Olympic stadium for swimming. I was like, oh, well, at least somebody found a use for AI.
Yeah. It's interesting to see the compute space in that way, like seeing how GPUs may change. But yeah, right now it's a little wild to see the power consumption and all that.
Yeah, so GPU computing is something that I studied academically years ago, being able to run general purpose programs in an actual graphics processor. And the level of sophistication that it takes to actually pull that off and then pull that off at scale is non-trivial. So when you have things like CUDA, which is the development library from NVIDIA to enable access to these platforms, it's interesting. So one of the things that I think is most interesting right now is the change in the compute paradigm that we're used to doing, executing things of throwing things onto a CPU or throwing things onto a set of CPUs to perform work. Now we have this GPU thing where you have a bunch of concurrency that can execute in a clock cycle, which is a totally different compute paradigm we've had before. And everyone's jammed up on the fact that AI is the only way that you can accelerate computation with GPUs. But we're at a really interesting point in time where we can leverage GPUs to do complex tasks at scale. But you have the opposing force of heat, scale, complexity that are challenging as well. So in addition to just the fact that AI is too cool, too hot, and sexy, folks are actually doing a new computational technique at scale to execute business functions, the real outcome is going to be what's next for that platform as we change the way that computers function, right?
Yeah. Interesting. I feel like it's always probably feels like this, but it's a very interesting time to work in IT and to be able to see things change before you, and you get to play a certain role in it by being in IT at this time, trying new technologies, being responsible for getting them implemented at your work or whatever the case may be. I try and be fortunate of that, because there are maybe other industries that aren't changing much and you don't get to kind of always be learning new things.
Yeah, it's definitely a privilege. I think when you asked like what drives me earlier, is that like there's always something new and shiny and fun to play with. And that I talked about what I do today at work, that's part of what I do. Like I get to take the tools off the shelf and build the new thing, and that might not have existed before. And that constant discovery, that's another facet of what keeps me doing what we do.
Fun stuff. What trends are you most excited about right now?
I want to see where AI actually lands. That's what, like I said, I'm paying a lot of attention to. I'm paying a lot of attention to obviously the storage market, because that's what I do for work. So we're doing some really cool innovations there on the platforms that we support and that we see also in the cloud. So there's some really interesting trends there. I think the next iteration of application development in the Kubernetes space is another area that I continue to pay attention to. And then obviously then there's another element of cloud that I pay a lot of attention to, is where folks, especially in large enterprises, have, they've done the all-in cloud bet, and then they realize that the meter spins too fast, right? The bill's too big. And now figuring out how to build cloud right infrastructures rather than cloud first infrastructures, and making sure that we have the right things and the right infrastructures in our world. And so I spend a lot of time kind of the repatriation of work.
What advice would you give to someone new to PowerShell or the tech industry who's trying to find their niche or trying to find their space in this IT industry?
This is the worst answer that any nerd is going to want to hear. Got to talk to.
Hey, I harp on that all the time on the pod, so I'm glad to hear it. It's always nice when the guests echo some really things that we say.
You crushed it. Like you came, I remember you said 2018 was your first conference, and you went in the deep end of the pool and talked to everybody. You shook hands, you smiled, you hung out, and did all the things. And that's like, as a nerd, that's so hard to do, and it's so draining. And that introvert energy that we all have. And so just figure out what you're comfortable with, and you have to get out there and shake the hands and meet the people. And then because the tech's easy, you can sit in a room and read the book. But if you're going to build that network and be able to meet folks like you and the rest of the PowerShell community and the Kubernetes community and the database community that I operate in, like those are strong, lifelong bonds that I'll have across those three different communities.
Yep. And to your earlier comment about, like you said, maybe I'm good, maybe I just got lucky. For me, I certainly got lucky to be able to attend PowerShell Summit in 2018 whenever I got the scholarship. And I think there are always different times when we do get lucky in our careers. It's a question of whether you take full advantage of the opportunity or you just kind of sit back. And I tried my best to take full advantage, and it's been a fun journey ever since then.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Also, similar to you, I had the benefit of having mentors and other people who would push me forward, where I could go to them and not just be trapped in my little introvert mind all day. And I think that's so instrumental. You got to find a community. You got to connect with others. You got to say hi to them, reach out, all that kind of good stuff, and your life will change.
Yeah. Oh, there's still time to this day. Because I'm a classic introvert extrovert, where I'll come to an event and I'll go straight to my room because I just don't have that energy that day. But maybe the next day I'm better. And so just as people just understand like where your boundaries are, but also kind of try to expand them.
That's what it's all about. Yeah, you got to know yourself and how you interact, and then always be trying to grow.
Yep.
Oh, it's so fun. You mentioned like being able to have these close relationships with people, and like, you're going to be working in your career for the foreseeable future. You can either have a lot of rich friendships that go year over year. Maybe you see them at the same conferences, or you could not. You'll still be working and showing up every day. It's just a matter of, do you want it to be really rewarding and wholesome, or kind of soul sucking and boring? You got to own your career and own that at some point. And I hope people out there listening take the impetus to really start taking ownership of their careers, because it can lead to amazing things. You never know what the upper bound limit, unless you push yourself, is.
Yeah, I think again, super fortunate that I barely consider my jobs work, because I've always enjoyed what I do. I always have had technologies and opportunities that were just fun and engaging. Now, don't get me wrong, over time, like, projects were hard and they weren't, things stink, it's not all sunshine and lollipops. You got to get through those things. But overall, the overarching theme is it's been fun doing what I do. And because I get to play with toys for a living. That's the way I look at it. Right.
So it is fun, and we do push ourselves. And based on what you've done historically, you've done a lot of work. Has there been a time when you found yourself over leveraged? How did you strike a balance in your kind of personal work life?
Yeah. That's so back in the consulting space, 100%. Like, in the beginning, you're trading time for money. And when a customer comes along, they're like, hey, I want to pay you money to do a thing. You're like, hey, I'm going to do that thing. And the next thing you know, 100%, 120% of your calendar is filled. And you're like, whoa, I don't like working 65 hours a week. That's not great. So then you pull back, do a couple things. You start saying no to work, which we talked a little bit about earlier. And you have to continue to make sure that your mental health is stable. Because if you just work all day in a high pressure environment, that the first thing that's going to go is your own ability to manage stress. And this is my personal experience, right? And so then you look around, and you're like, whoa, I'm like an angry hornet, right? So then you have to invest in yourself to make sure that you're making the right decisions, exercising, meditating, just not working, whatever it is, to manage that balance. And just, you have to have those checkpoints to make sure that you're not on that edge. And I think one of the key things, in addition to exercise, meditation, all the fun stuff that I talked about a second ago, has been times where I've just walked away for a month. Like, I need to go clear my head. And again, super privileged to be able to have the opportunity to do that. But in the end, like, that's how you're going to be able to make this thing last over time, or else you're going to burn out and things aren't going to.
Yeah. I find for me, especially when you're putting yourself out there, there's a different kind of, like with Pluralsight courses or whatever, there's a different kind of thing that comes with that. It's not the worst in the world, but I'm in a similar boat where sometimes I see myself getting a little backed up. All right, I'm taking 2 weeks off. I need a full reset.
Yeah.
And then come back. And I think a lot of it is about knowing yourself. And, we're all different. So like, your limits are going to be different than mine, that are going to be different than Sally's and Bob's. But you got to strike that balance. And for me, the best skills I've invested in, honestly, PowerShell is pretty high up there, but just the emotional intelligence side of things and
100%.
Understanding yourself more. That is, for me, what enables me to drive change across an org. It's the understanding myself, not stepping on people's toes or being rude, and being self-aware enough to know. Because if you don't put in that work, you can just be confused in not having success and have no insights as to why, start blaming others, and go down a whole tunnel that won't lead to anything productive for you or anyone around you.
Yeah, there's the first time I realized I was ahead of my skis, or I was at 120%. It was about 2010, and you used the term emotional intelligence. And at that time, around that time, a book called Search Inside Yourself came out. It's an emotional intelligence book that I've read 6 times. And whenever my personal check engine light goes on, I go back to that book and I take some of the techniques from that book and I bring them into my daily routine that help restabilize me. And so that book has helped me be able to manage stress, demands, how I respond to stressful situations, how I respond to challenging people at the workplace. And that really has changed my perspective on that. So I highly recommend Search Inside Yourself. It's emotional intelligence plus self-awareness and meditation program all wrapped up into one. And it's written by an ex-Google engineer. So like quite literally someone that has been in these shoes, and how he was able to build a program at Google to help engineers manage these kind of challenges, because our jobs are hard. Actually, let me say that. Correct that. Our jobs are very demanding, right? I mean, the job's fun. It's not hard. It's fun, but it's demanding. Don't get me wrong. And that book has helped me over the years stay stable.
Sweet. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And I'll say, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't do people, I don't do that. The benefit of emotional intelligence is it is flexible. You can increase it. It's not fixed like your IQ or whatever. So you can get better. You can grow. You can find yourself in places you'd never imagine. Good stuff there. I will definitely check out that book. I've been looking for, I got to add that more meditation in my life. You know, I'm kind of all over the place. I call myself a mad scientist because I'm just chasing passion all the time. And like, okay, I'm going to journal for this week and then totally forget I even have a journal. And then I'm like, everything's out of sorts. Oh yeah, I usually do better when I journal. It's a juggling process for me.
But you know that about yourself and you just ride that wave, right?
Yep. Yeah. When you're feeling the passion, chase things, do the blogs, put together the talks. And when things are chilling, you're a little over leveraged, take a step back, rely on the work in the past and, to carry you through till you find that time again.
Yep.
All right. Well, you've nailed every question so far. I got a few off the wall questions for you now.
Okay.
Yeah. We call these the common parameters. We ask most guests these questions, and I'm going to mix it up with one from Stephen Judd. He has a question for you, which is,
okay.
And it's going to be a hard one. I don't know if you're going to even know this off the top, but what is the funniest thing or the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you at a job or at work? I know it's a hard one.
There's so many things. Wish I had a minute to prep on that. Hardest or weirdest thing? I mean, I've taken some systems down over the years. There's that. We've all done that.
Oh yeah.
Right? Yeah. There was one time where I torched 250,000 rows in a database table. And once that funny feeling in my stomach went away, I went and got the data back. Right. There's those kind of situations. I think I'm drawing a blank on that one. I'll have to come back to you.
It's a tough one. So no worries. Yeah. With your knowledge now and all the things you've learned through your career, what's one tip you would give your younger self when starting in IT?
Take care of yourself physically better is probably the biggest one. That night I slept on a data center floor because a backup or restore was taking too long. Like, did I really have to do that? I don't know. But just remember that you're a human first before you're an employee. And take care of yourself better.
That's good advice. What are 3 of your favorite modules or projects?
Oh, dude, DBA tools all day.
Yeah.
Yeah. That DBA tools. So I dabbled in PowerShell and the 2016-17 time. And then once DBA tools came out, I was like, this is the way. And it was full steam ahead because I was able to affect change at scale, typical PowerShell story of managing configurations, being able to manage systems at scale, and DBA tools 100% enabled that. Not a big fan of the original PowerShell Azure module. That was Azure RM back then before it became the AZ module. Not a fan of that one. Primarily because I wrote a bunch of Pluralsight content, and then a week later, they changed the modules, which invalidated my entire course that I wrote. I was like, oh, I don't like you. But then the new module came out, and it's pretty good. So a big fan of the AZ module. And I think right now, and this is not a plug for my work stuff, I'm really pleased with the PowerShell module that Pure has to manage its system. And I get to work with Mike Nelson, who was here last, to drive that module forward internally from a product standpoint. And it allows us and our customers to do all the typical PowerShell things, at scale, be able to do things, repeatable processes. And so I've been a big fan of being able to use that in our user community.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anthony, for another episode of the PowerShell Podcast.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
We'll be here every week. Thank you, everyone out there. If you're walking, driving, running, whatever you're doing, thank you for listening. Anthony, people got something out of this. They're still listening right now. They're hearing me say this right now. They love the episode. They want to connect with Anthony more. They want to see what's this guy up to. Where can they find you on the World Wide Web?
I think I used to spend a lot of time on Twitter, not so much anymore, but I'm still monitoring Twitter. So if you need to hit me up, probably the easiest place. LinkedIn all day. I've been cultivating a good community there. Those are probably the 2 primary.
I've been pleased with LinkedIn
lately. Yeah.
Lately it's there's limited options. So LinkedIn has been nice. I like the long posts, still a lot of spam and like clickbaity videos of like a monkey doing a backflip to accompany something about like passwords are important or something.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing, I left this part out in the beginning, with regards to like outreach, community and engaging in the community. And I was able to engage in the communities online, mostly on Twitter and LinkedIn. So that's a way to find folks that are interested in the things that you do. And so I spent a bunch of years on Twitter. That's where the database community and the PowerShell community hung out. And, it's kind of changed over time to other locations. So, a big part is finding your community.
Got to find one, got to grow with them. Awesome. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet, sir.
If you're listening and you enjoyed this episode, share it with a coworker, somebody you know. Get PowerShell everywhere. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.